Let me start by stating the obvious. The enemy is at Gitmo, period. And because of the brave work of our special operators and others who were involved in the capture of the 9/11 crew and others, we have some of the nation's sworn and acknowledged and professed enemies in custody at Gitmo. And for those of you who haven't been to Gitmo or followed this file, let me just do quick Gitmo by the numbers. Today there's 166 detainees there coming from 23 different countries. That's down from a high of 779 at its peak. And for those of you who have a real life and haven't followed detention issues, like I have, we've detained over 100,000 individuals since the war against terrorists. We joined it in 2001. Most of those were in Iraq, and those were security internees, a different category, but still the enemy. Many were in Afghanistan, 30,000 or so in Afghanistan. And the detainees, for the most part, were culled from the detainee population in Afghanistan, although with a few minor exceptions. There are 4 pending military commissions cases at Guantanamo in the Expeditionary Legal Compound, which I had the privilege of helping design when I was working for Secretary Rumsfeld and Gates. And as a former federal prosecutor, I know a little bit about courtrooms. There's al-Nashiri, or al-Nashri as he prefers to call himself, the USS Cole bomber. There's the 9/11 case. There's 5 co-conspirators in the 9/11 case. KSM, who's obviously the operational mastermind of 9/11. Walid bin Attash, Ramzi bin al-Shib, Omar al-Baluchi, and Mustafa al-Hassawi. These are financiers, providers, etc. Al-Darby, it's another military commissions case that's ongoing. And he's charged with his involvement in terrorist attacks against shipping vessels in the Straits of Hormuz, and actually the actual attack against a French oil tanker, the MV Lindbergh. And finally, our very own native-born Baltimorean, Majid Khan, who comes from a distinguished and shady family from Baltimore, and he's been charged with murder, among other things, the 2003 bombing of the JW Marriott in Indonesia, and the attempted murder of the former Pakistani president, Musharraf. I start with commissions, not because I was asked to talk about it, but because my point is this. Gitmo is going to be open for business for a while, despite the president's speech last week. And that's because there's no political momentum towards bringing those particular cases, and a few more that will be filed, to the United States. So at least military commissions will continue at Gitmo. And I predict detention operations will also continue at Gitmo for a period of time. Now, last week, as many of you know, the President gave a much heralded speech about counterterrorism policies. He covered a lot of topics. And near the end of the speech, which I recommend that you read, he talked about Gitmo. But right before he talked about Gitmo, he talked about the need to wind down the war and the need and the desire on his part to eventually have Congress repeal the authorization for use of military force, which, as you all know, was signed into law 1 week after 9/11 attacks. Well, what he didn't say was the obvious, and that is, once the AUMF is repealed, you no longer have the ability legally to detain people under the law of war. You must let them go, period, unless you can charge them with something, either in military commissions or federal court. So when the President ends his speech by saying, even after we take all these steps, and I'm going to walk through his speech a little bit to sort of give you some flavor, even after we take all these steps and get rid of this part of the population and this part of the population and transfer these people and blah, 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 quote, how to deal with those Gitmo detainees who we know have participated in dangerous plots or attacks, but who cannot be prosecuted for example, because the evidence against them has been compromised or is inadmissible in a court of law. And I would just parenthetically say they would include people like al-Qahtani, the 20th hijacker, and Abu Zubaydah. And then he says, but once we commit to a process of closing Gitmo, I am confident that this legacy problem can be resolved, consistent with our commitment to the rule of law. Now, I said on Fox News, not even a week after the president was sworn in, watch what they do, not what they say. And if you think about the last few years, that is just true. I didn't make up this expression. It's nothing new, but it's very applicable here. If you repeal the AUMF, Abu Zubaydah and Mohammed Qahtani, the 20th hijacker, and all the other tough cases that he's referring to, go home. Because they can't be prosecuted. And so what he's not telling you, but I'm telling you, is that when the AUMF is repealed, the 20th hijacker goes home. Abu Zubaydah goes home. Now, after World War II, for you military buffs or historical buffs, we continued to detain a good number of individuals, even after the war was over, in what was called a wind-down phase. I'm here to tell you, I think that that wind-down phase is much shorter today, if it exists at all. Now let me peel back a little bit the other part of his speech. When I was working for Secretary Rumsfeld, even before Gates came into office, I was tasked with figuring out what to do if and when President Bush sent the order across the river, close Gitmo. And so the Pentagon, as you know, as you particularly know, has thousands of contingency plans, and this was the contingency plan that I was in charge of pulling together. So I did my job and tried to pull it together. And it's classified, so I'm not going to go into it, but suffice to say that that plan of how to close it and where to put them is still over there, because I've talked to administration officials in the Obama administration about that. The president said, and remember a little history here. When Obama came into office, he had the House and the Senate in his own party. And what I have said publicly on NPR and other places about the classified study is that to close Gitmo, you have to work on 4 things simultaneously. And you have to work really hard at all 4. Legal, logistical, political, and diplomatic efforts. All have to be working in sync, and you have to spend political capital in all 4 areas. Money, political capital, logistical push, and you know in the Pentagon it's hard to get things done quickly, but they can do it when the order comes down. And he had a window of opportunity, about 2 years, to spend the political capital to close Gitmo. He didn't do it. He put his political capital in TARP, Obamacare, and all these other things that you all deal with regularly. So when the president says in his speech, quote, "As president, I have tried to close Gitmo," I don't see the evidence of that. I see the aspiration. I see the executive orders that were signed, but I don't see the raw, big boulder, push down the hill political capital to get it done. He says, I transferred 67 detainees, well, he didn't do it, the DOD did it, to other countries before Congress imposed restrictions. Congress imposed restrictions. By the way, the Democratic Congress imposed restrictions against their own party's president because they didn't trust him not to bring them to the United States. And they didn't want, as a political matter, to have them here in the United States. And that's where we stand today. That's still where they stand today. The president said something else. No person has ever escaped from one of our own supermax military prisons in the United or military prisons in the United States. No kidding. That's not the point. No one has ever said that if we bring them here, they'll escape. The issue is whether they would accrue additional rights and privileges, especially constitutional rights, that they don't have at Gitmo. The right they have at Gitmo right now is the constitutional right to habeas, and they've been pursuing those habeas cases in the federal district and federal circuit court for years, and some have won. The president said, quote, "There is no justification beyond politics for Congress to prevent us from closing the facility," unquote. It's the lack of political courage and politics on part of the administration and the unwillingness to spend the political capital early on is why we are where we are. And that has caused all sorts of ripple effects, and I'll end with this. You hear in the news today, because there's always news that pops up at Guantanamo, the news sort of goes silent about Gitmo, and then a few months later, the news pops up about Gitmo. That there are a number of hunger strikers there. And by the way, there have been hunger strikers in every prison facility in the world, including Bobby Sands in Ireland and elsewhere, including Gitmo, since the beginning of Gitmo. I believe, based on good knowledge and having not only reviewed the protocol for the hunger strikers with professionals, watched them being fed, that this current round of hunger striking is in part because of their frustration that the president didn't follow through on his own promise to them that he would close it. They believed him at their peril. And so, yes, they've engaged in political protests in the form of hunger strikes for years. I think at any given time we have 2 or 3 hunger striking. At other times, around September 11th or Christmas time, they engage in political protests and hunger strike to make it uncomfortable or unfortunate for the guards so they can't go on vacation, and to remind us about 9/11. But the fact that this administration has decided to use the same policy that the Bush administration is, and that is you have the right to politically protest, you have the right to include hunger striking as that political protest, we're just not going to let you die, is not surprising. And I don't know how it's going to turn out in terms of these hunger strikers, whether all of them, all 166, will eventually hunger strike, I don't know. But I can say this with some degree of confidence, that if and when the AUMF is repealed, we have to cut them loose, unless we charge them. And until the AUMF is repealed, and until this president has decided to spend real political capital, perhaps in the face of Congress's restrictions, and just start sending detainees home, especially the Yemenis, who represent the majority of the population there, the facility as a detention facility will remain working. I found it interesting that the president uses the pronoun I when he wants to take credit for stuff, and then at other places in the speech he talked about, now, you know, DOD requested, you know, $200 million to keep the facility open. That's just not right. Well, he is DOD. He's the commander-in-chief. It's just an interesting observation as a former English teacher. So I'm going to stop there. Before I do that, let me just say this as a military officer who's just, you know, went over 20 years, the XO of the Navy Marine Corps trial judiciary. I'm a trial judge, third-generation Navy officer. We cannot criminalize war. We have to retain the capacity to detain the enemy for 2 reasons. One, it's the right thing to do, it's the humane thing to do, it's the Geneva Convention's thing to do, but because detaining the enemy actually shortens wars. That's a hard concept for some people to believe. But if you bring them in for an hour, give them a soda, a Kit Kat bar, and put them back out there, it prolongs the war because it rearms the enemy. That is the reality of war. Detention of the enemy during wartime is a time-honored tradition, and it needs to be part and parcel of the overall effort to ultimately defeat and win this war. So I'll stop there and be delighted to take any and all of your questions. Yes, sir, from SOCOM.
Yeah, George Nicholson, a question. One of the things that the president talked about was, in his speech, was what we're going to do about drone, actually it's RPV, strikes. No collateral damage, which I think is absolutely ludicrous. Is that going to be moved over and say, if you're a captain of a submarine, and when you launch a cruise missile, you have to have assurances that you're not going to have any collateral damages? I remember when we were on the Iranian hostage rescue mission, I didn't go into the White House with my boss, Jim Kyle, but Signet Brzezinski turned to him and says, can you assure us that you can go in and you're not going to have to injure any Iranians? And I thought that Charlie Beckwith was going to come unglued and says, I'm going to tell the mothers and fathers and sons and daughters the reason their relative got killed or wounded was because we didn't want to enter it. So that difficulty, again, we've seen maybe Al-Qaeda, the head's been chopped off in some areas, but we've seen this morphing around the world. So to go ahead and revoke our current laws, then how do we get the authorities of going after targets in Mali, or whether it's what we're currently having to do in Pakistan or other areas of the world? It just seems a very slippery slope we're going down.
Yeah, George, it's a great question, and one I've given a lot of thought to even before the President made this aspirational speech. I wonder, on the one hand, whether that aspiration to reduce to the point of zero the number of collateral damage or civilian casualties will actually become practice. I rather doubt it, because I believe in the military. I believe in the commander's ultimate authority to make the call, weighing all the competing interests. I believe that JAGs representing, advising commanders will give them the left and right bookends of the rules of engagement. But ultimately, it's the commander's responsibility to make these calls. And there'll come a point, and you obviously are a student of history, look back for the last 50 years. I mean, we've seen this waxing and waning of the desire to tighten down the SRO, the standing rules of engagement, to the point where operators can't operate, where it's almost like a civilian SWAT team where only the sniper who has 100% proficiency at the range can take the shot, and it has to be when there's no wind. I mean, it's not going to happen. And if it did happen, even for a short period of time, then we lose the ability to be on the offense, and we end up being somewhat on the defense. So I haven't read the classified document that's out there that allegedly is attempting to implement this. I suspect if I did, and was in the Joint Operations Center when the folks were discussing it and seeing whether it was realistic. In practice, I just don't think that we're ever going to get to the point where war is so precise. And remember, George, 25 years ago, the discussions were about cluster munitions and all the rest of it, and the desire for more and more precise weapons. Well, we're here. And here we are where we have a precision of war and a precision of instrumentality of warfare that is beyond even the wildest imagination of people 25 years ago, and yet we're still complaining. Now, any non-combatant who's killed in wartime, it's a sad thing, but it's the reality of wartime. And, yeah.
Quick follow on that. Also, the difficulties of moving things from the CIA under Title 50 over to the military under Title 10. And from your experience, the problems that creates, the flexibility the CIA has of operating under Title 50, as opposed to us sort of being hamstringed within DOD, having to operate under Title 10.
I was fascinated by the article in the Washington Post, what was it, a week ago, a week and a half ago, or the New York Times, both of which I read every day, about the level of experience and sophistication that CIA operators who work in the drone program have achieved over the years, vice the precision and rules under which the military operators would have to operate. That's not to take away from the proficiency of either. And I think in practice it may be more difficult than there is to it. I think what you are seeing from the 50,000-foot level is a failure on the Obama administration's part to get out in front of this issue and explain in public venues to the extent they could the need for drone strikes. Just like the Bush administration, I believe, didn't take advantage of opportunities to explain in concrete terms the need to detain the enemy for the duration of hostilities, including the existence of Gitmo. And so it's not like they weren't warned. John Bellinger had a piece in the Washington Post several years ago warning the administration, get out in front of this, start speaking about it, or drones are going to become your Guantanamo, and of course it has. So I think from the 50,000-foot level, George, you're going to see more, the push, the political push for more transparency in drone operations. And you're going to see from the operators and from the people who really do it a very quiet, silent push back saying we can only go so far.
Cully, I wanted to ask you if you can expand on the transfer of detainees to other countries.
Yeah.
What kind of authority does the president have to undertake these kinds of transfers, like to Yemen, for example?
Mm-hmm.
And what role, if any, does Congress have or should have in oversight of those kinds of transfers?
Well, it's interesting. With all due respect to your bosses, for those of you who still work on the Hill, Congress has had sort of a schizophrenic approach to detainee policy. Sometimes they totally engage, and oftentimes, other times they just don't engage at all, and when they probably should have. But that's politics on any given issue, I suspect. I don't do politics, I just do policy. The Congress has decided in the last few years, NDAAs, to place transfer restrictions on the administration for detainees not only in Guantanamo, but also in Bagram, which we no longer have a large population of detainees in Bagram. We just have a few what are called ESTs, enduring security threats. And we probably won't have them for much longer. But those transfer restrictions essentially say, one, you can't bring them to the States. Two, you can't spend money to bring them to the United States or build facilities or upgrade facilities here in the United States. And three, you have to give us prior notification of any intent to transfer them to their home of record, their home country, or a third country. And fourth, for any transfer off that island, the Secretary of Defense himself has to personally certify that it's in the national security interest of the United States. And, you know, Bob Gates, a smart guy. He didn't sign off on one. Panetta didn't sign off on one. We'll see whether the President orders Hagel to sign off on these transfers, because that's what it'll take. It'll take the President to say to the Secretary of Defense, we're upping the risk quotient. There is no risk-free transfer from Gitmo. And by the way, there is no risk-free transfer or release from any jail anywhere. And people who live in the world, and I know this is politics, but people who live in the world that think that you can have a risk-free transfer from a jail, you're living in la-la land. The people who come out of the D.C. City jail every day, when they probably shouldn't, but because it's too crowded, some of them, many of them go back to commit crimes. So people who've left Gitmo, some of them have gone back to combatant activity. But he's going to have to order the Secretary of Defense to personally sign off on those individuals. I suspect he'll have full immunity if they go back to combatant activity. I think he did say in his speech that he's going to lift the restriction. That's a self-imposed restriction, so it's no big deal to send the Yemenis back in a methodical and thoughtful way. And by the way, from a historical perspective, the big three populations of Gitmo were the Yemenis, the Saudis, and the Afghans. And the Bush administration worked out a program with the Afghans and worked out a program with the Saudis to transfer many of those back, most of those back, and put them through either in Saudi Arabia this rehabilitation program, and in Afghanistan we had a different protocol that we used. But Yemen doesn't have the capacity to mitigate the threat that these guys pose. They have told us that. They've told us that if we sent them back to Yemen, they don't have the legal authorities to hold them, and even if they did, they'd still be out in the street within a few weeks or early months. And so after the Christmas Day attempted bomber, the Yemeni, who did that, that's when the administration, after being pushed by me and others to stop the transfers, imposed a self-imposed transfer restriction on the Yemenis. But I suspect that you're going to see a number of those folks heading back. It's not as if countries don't want these people back, like the caller said to me on NPR earlier this week. Well, none of these countries want these people back, says the lady. The lady's wrong. A lot of these countries want their detainees back. The Yemenis want their detainees back. They've been asking for them for years. We just know that it's not in our national security interest to send them back at this time, at least the ones that are still there. There are detainees at Gitmo who have been cleared for release by the administration. And so I think if there's blame to be had, it's the lack of political courage and will to either flout Congress's rules and say, by the way, I'm here to announce as the Secretary of Defense that that in the last week we've transferred 45 people off of Gitmo, and now we're giving Congress a notification of where they are. Thank you, hold your hearings. It's going to require something that bold.
And what's the recidivism rate?
Well, you never know what a real recidivism rate is because you don't know until you catch them, right? So Billy Bob over here, who's in jail for attempted murder, who got caught for that particular crime, Could have been his first time, could have been his 50th time doing something criminal. So just like in that context, we don't know what the real recidivism rate is. To quote my old boss, these are the unknown unknowns. You never know what the real recidivism rate is. Whatever the rate the DIA establishes, and I've worked closely with them when I was there on trying to neck it down and make it more solid, I suspect the number has to be a little higher, at least a little higher, because there are people who went back to the activity, but we never know about it. And I suspect that some of the people who they think went back to activity didn't go back to activity. The number's somewhere in the 15, 20, 25% range, but I don't have a high degree of confidence of that. It's not zero.
We're going to have to move on to the next speaker. I just have one last quick question. What do you see as the time frame here? Because so much of this seems to be motivated by domestic politics, at least at the appearance level, with a whole lot of other variables that are happening that are much more realistic in terms of the external ability of the Yemenis to keep people inside prisons. I know there's a whole history of Yemeni prison breaks, for example, as well. Are we seeing this potentially just drifting into 2014, or do you see it as something that they'll try and do right away so the damage gets done early?
I have a greater chance of playing in the NBA than getting this answer right. And I'm 5'7", and a few weeks away from 50 years old, so I'm not going to be playing in the NBA.
Best guess.
I mean, the commission's cases are still in pretrial motions.
Okay.
They're going to need some of those detainees who are not defendants to be there as witnesses. I mean, I think unless the president takes bold action, and I don't see any willingness on the part of Congress to lift the restrictions, we're well past the next election and maybe the next few elections. But, you know, I could be wrong.
Okay, so status quo would be the highest probability.
I think you're going to see, my best guess, my best educated guess, knowing that there are former colleagues of mine who I still consider to be friends working on these issues, who are career people, that you're going to start to see a trickle of people going back to Yemen, going back to some of these other countries, and the SecDef will get hauled up here before the SASC, and it's probably in closed-door hearings, you know, when they want to get to the bottom of it. You know, how did you show us the evidence that you used to determine that it was in the national security interest to transfer this guy, you know, detainee 279. I don't even know if that's a real number, but they have these 3-digit internment serial numbers. So I think that's my best guess.